Hey, it's Jag. What is drift?
Yeah.
Not that kind. So what do I mean by drift? What I'm talking about is audio drift. When you are doing a audio recording, whether it's just in Logic and you're recording a song, or whether you're doing a YouTube video and you are recording audio for that video, you might be using two cameras, audio from something like Logic. You might be doing playing things back on your screen. You record audio for all of the devices you're using because it's a convenient way to synchronize everything. I'll show you a little bit of that when we get into Final Cut Pro later. Over time, one track gets a little behind or maybe even a little ahead, and so your audio doesn't line up. This is different than latency. Latency can be looked at as a form of drift, I guess, because you have two tracks that are out of line, but they are exactly out of line at the beginning and the end by the same amount. Fixing issues related to latency is pretty easy. Your actual audio segments in those files are exactly the same length. So you just slide this one over. It lines up at the beginning, lines up at the end, no problem. But with audio drift, the issue becomes really problematic to deal with, because if everything is lined up at the front, you get down to the end and it's off, so you just take it and you line it up at the end. Well, now all of a sudden at the beginning, your audio is out of sync at the beginning. We're going to look at some ways to deal with that, but I'm just going to show you some examples of these things. So first of all, latency. What I have is two tracks here in Logic that are recorded from the same source, but they're recorded through two different devices, and one had slightly more latency. One was committing the audio later than the other one. So we have a mismatch. Looking at the screen, you can see my two tracks recorded from the same source at the same time. The second one is late. It's not late by a whole lot. We're at 8.37 up here for this start, and we're at 8.41, 0.04 slower. That's at the beginning of the file. The end of the file, 6 minutes, 7 seconds, 29.45 frames later, you can see that the bottom track is still late, but it's still late by the same amount, 0.04 frames. Here we're at 29.45. We go to the start here, and it's exactly 0.04 frames late still, 29.49. So that file is not in sync, but it's not in sync by exactly the same amount all the way along. Let's play these and see what we can tell by playing them. They're not going to be super out of sync. We're not going to hear this like a delay, but we're going to hear it as a phasing. First of all, we will mute the track that has the latency. I'll start every example with a clap so that I can cut that as the very beginning. Now we bring the one that has the latency in. I'll start every example with a clap so that I can cut that as the very... You can hear that phasing artifact. There are plugins that can adjust for latency, or you can manually line it up. All I do is I drag my file so that it lines up. And that's it. If we play the two tracks together, you will hear we don't have that phasing anymore, because now they are phase aligned. The two tracks will sum, and we will just get a 3 dB boost in volume. Psychoacoustically, a louder signal might seem to have a different tone, but it doesn't. The main thing is we aren't going to have that phasing anymore. Here again is the track without the second track. I'll start every example with a clap so that I can cut that as the very beginning. And if I go back here and enable the track that did have latency but we've lined up, I'll start every example with a clap so that I can cut that as the very beginning. There's no phasing there anymore. So that is latency. The file is out of sync, but it's exactly the same amount out of sync at the beginning of the file as it is at the end of the file. So nothing has drifted. So I'll show you a drift example now. You see here in our example for drift, the waveforms don't look as similar as the examples for the latency did, but you can see that they start at the same place. If we go down to the end, 26 minutes and 14 seconds and 4.13 frames, our audio has drifted quite considerably. The second track finishes quite a bit early. The main track is at 26 minutes 14 seconds, 10.71 frames, over 6 frames of difference. That's drift. Everything started out in sync, but by the end it was out of sync. We're just going to play both tracks together because there's no reason playing them separately. I've had my Tonex capture and Tonex pep. We don't hear anything odd there. No strange delays, no phasing, nothing. But what happens down at the end of the file? Just before you finish up here. So nice delay, but we didn't want it. One of the most common things that causes extreme drift is mismatching your sample rates. If you don't understand why your sample rates have to match, you might just record and say, well, this should just be fine. What I have here is I have 2 tracks. This one, which was recorded at 48 kilohertz here though. And that my voice sounds normal. Everything sounds okay. That's because our sample rates match, the recording sample rate and the playback rate. But this other track down here, I changed Logic to 44.1 kilohertz, made a recording, and then set my session back. So I am effectively mixing a 44.1 kilohertz track into my 48 kilohertz track without doing anything to compensate for that. If you listen to it, like I said, to 44.1 kilohertz here though, and it's faster and it sounds like I've been inhaling helium. If you go the other way without rendering it or resampling it, and that's the key part, you will hear what happens here. I've changed, like I said, to 44.1 kilohertz here though. And send me $50,000 if you want to see your dog again. So that's what happens when you use those files without accommodating that change. But let's say I get a file from somebody else and it was recorded at 44.1. What do? I need to convert it. You could select that file. I'm not going to go through the whole process, and you can bounce it out at the rate that you want. This is one way you would do it, but it's actually easier than that. Logic will recognize the file when you bring it in. Here I have my 48 kilohertz session file, and over here on my screen I have the audio file that was recorded in 44.1, but I want to use it in my 48K project and I don't want it to sound funny. All I need to do is just drag it in. Logic will look at it and you can see it automatically converted the sample rate to match my project rate. So now when I play it, even though it was originally recorded at 44.1 kilohertz, if I play it now, because Logic resampled it variously 16-bit, 24-bit, it sounds right. I haven't been inhaling helium and I don't sound like I'm going to demand a ransom. And by the way, I should say what we're doing lining these audio files up is we're letting the equipment freewheel, is the term that I use. In other words, they're all recording using their own internal time code clocks. Nowadays, equipment is built to pretty high standards. We have really good technology, and clocks aren't that much different between your different devices. So they generally will line up at least close enough to use, but these things are not using the same clock, so they can be a little bit out of sync just by the nature of the way that we're recording. Like I say, freewheeling. We have no connection. We don't have them all using a common clock. Most consumer level equipment doesn't even have the facility to sync one thing to another using the same clock. Not with cameras. We can do that a lot with musical equipment. Timing is everything with music. So you can do that with a lot of audio equipment, but most cameras, even the cameras that most people are using to do YouTube content, they don't have a way to have those have a common clock for those things to sync them up. We're just hoping that everything is close enough that they'll line up without any obvious issues. You can have small amounts of drift, very small, probably not even noticeable, by letting equipment freewheel and then lining it up after you record. When recording audio, video, anything, you want to make sure your audio sample rates are set the same. I always work in my audio workstation at 48 kilohertz. I could go to 96. I don't have a reason to right now. We won't even get into that. I also could record at 44.1K. We often do when we're working with some of the other people that we work with. And it doesn't really matter. It comes down to your preference and if you hear a difference and why you might want to use a higher or lower rate. You can look into those things. I know the reasons, we're not covering them here. A couple of other terms that you want to maybe consider or that you should be aware of and understand what they mean, and that is bit depth and bit rate. Bit depth has no time component to it. So bit depth cannot affect the sync of your audio recordings. Bit depth has to do with your dynamic range. Something that was recorded in 16-bit and something that was recorded 24-bit isn't going to cause you a problem with your synchronization of your files. There are other things to be concerned with bit depth. When you go from a high bit depth to a low bit depth, you do want to dither the file. Again, more homework for you. Look that up. Bit rate is a whole other thing, and you shouldn't confuse bit rate with bit depth. And I'm not even going to describe bit rate. You can get such a headache looking at all of this stuff. I'm not concerned with bit rate for projects because I always record 48K 16-bit depth or 48K 24-bit depth or 44.1 16 or 24. And bitrate doesn't come into it for what I'm doing. Bitrate for me comes into it when I'm finalizing a project and what that project is going to go out for. If it's going to go on a streaming service that you don't have a lot of bandwidth, you want to go with a lower bit rate. But I take the whole finished project and convert it to that bit rate. If you're working with compressed or lossy files in your regular recording sessions, first of all, you should avoid that if you can. But sometimes you might need to take an MP3 and bring it into a Logic project. But you have to know how to convert that to work then in your session, and we're not going to cover that here. It can be done, but I wouldn't recommend doing it as a matter of course. Just try and get everything all in the same at the same sample rate. Frame rate doesn't really matter for your audio files. It's not part of the coding into the audio files when they're standalone audio files. The reason Logic has frame rate is because if you bring a video into Logic to work with to synchronize whatever you're working on, then you need to be concerned with the frame rate of the file you're bringing in and the frame rate your session's in. In your project setting, you can set your frame rates. So if you were going to work with a video, somebody sent you a video 29.97 frames per second drop frame, you could set your project to that. It won't adversely affect anything you've done to this point. So now we're going to get on to looking at what do we do in Final Cut Pro and what are some of the things that can affect drift in Final Cut Pro. In general, video is recorded at 48 kilohertz. So we want to have our cameras and our audio all set to 48 kilohertz. The audio can be 24-bit, and there's benefits to doing that. For me and the two cameras that I use anyway, they can only do 48 kilohertz 16-bit, and it's not a problem that the audio files I use will be 24-bit and the video files will have audio at 16. As long as everything matches 48 kilohertz between our audio and our cameras, we're going to be fine. The other thing with cameras you want to be concerned about is frame rate. And that's how many frames per second are being captured by your camera. It's very similar to sample rate for audio files. And again, you can look up these things. I'm not going to explain these things in depth. The most common things you'll hear in terms of frame rate are 30 frames per second, 29.97 frames per second non-drop, and 29.9 frames per second drop. Also 23.98 frames per second. Those are all different standards used for different things. Understanding how they work takes a lot a lot of time, and it will give you a headache. And I tried to explain it when I shot this stuff the first time, and I talked for about 2 hours and still didn't really get anything that I felt like explained what frame rates are. So you need to look at that. So what we're going to say for now, just set your equipment so it matches. That can get a little confusing with cameras because generally video is shot at 29.97 frames per second drop frame, but it's often just referred to as 30 frame per second. But 30 frame per second is an actual thing too. So you want to know what frame rate your cameras are in and match them if you can. You cannot always match your frame rates. And in a similar way that I showed you that Logic will take a 44.1K audio file and upsample it into a 48K project, Final Cut Pro does a pretty good job of matching frame rates, of they call it conforming frame rates to fit your project. Not all of your cameras will necessarily be the same. I use a Canon EOS 250D and a Sony ZV-1. They both record at 29.97 frames per second drop. I also can set them to 23.96. The difference there, and the thing that can get confusing, and I don't know why it's like this, the Canon actually tells you that it's 29.97 frames per second, but it doesn't specify whether it's drop frame or non-drop. You have to figure that out, and there's ways to do that. The Sony ZV-1 also records at 29.97 frames per second drop, but they just call it 30. So I don't know why. I guess most people only use one camera and use the onboard audio and they never have to worry about it, and good. But when you're trying to do this kind of thing, there's a lot of gotchas with that kind of stuff. Oh, and then when you look at, I said non-drop and drop frame per second. Now, two things we have there is we have drop frame or non-drop frame. You can have dropped frames. We're making a distinction between drop frame and dropped frame. So a dropped frame is when your equipment can't keep up, so it just skips capturing a few frames of video. That's the basic explanation. Whereas drop frame, it's not actually discarding or losing anything. What it's doing is it's adjusting its counter, the code that you see. It's skipping labeling frames, I guess would be the best way to say it. Like I say, this can get really confusing, but drop frame is not losing anything. Dropped frames is. So when we say 29.9 frames per second drop frame, doesn't mean we're losing anything. But if Final Cut Pro is not keeping up, your computer's not keeping up with what you're trying to do, you can have dropped frames, and that does lose things. I suggest that you take some time and look into what is sample rate, how do sample rates relate to each other, how does bit depth relate, how does bit rate relate to everything, and how does frame rate work? How do those things, what do those things mean? And you're probably, if you've never thought about this, never heard about it, never learned about it, you're not going to get it really fast. It's something you're going to have to work on and work on and work on over time. As you see things work, gradually you will start to get an understanding of what these things mean. So here we have, I'm using an example of a clip, about a 26, 27 minute clip of stuff I shot for the video I did of my Tonex captor. I released that video a couple weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago. Go look at that. The Tonex captor is amazing, and I love that thing. I'm still geeking out over it and hoping to do some more videos about it. The whole reason I'm doing this thing about drift, though, was when I did that project, I ended up with drift, and that's why I'm using this. I pared it down to 3 sources for this clip. I have footage from my EOS, footage from my ZV-1, and then I have a screen capture. So the first thing we need to do with these 3 sources is we need to sync them up in a file so we can choose which source we want to use at various parts in our video. I'll use the same audio track all the way through, but the video tracks will change. I need to create my multicam clip before I can see how things are syncing up. It's easy to do in Final Cut Pro. You select all of your clips, you right click, and you say new multicam clip. And here you can choose a number of things. You can name your clip. I can choose where to put it. I create an event called multicam for my multicam, so that's where I'll put it. Down here you can see what our frame rate is. We're 29.97 frames per second, and we're using drop frame. People often say, well, how can I tell which is which? If you're looking at your time code designations here, you see we have 00 hours, colon, 00 minutes, colon, 00 seconds, semicolon, 00 frames. The semicolon means it's a drop frame format. If I turn off drop frame, you will see that now I have a colon between the seconds and frames. So that means it's a non-drop frame rate. Not a good thing or bad thing. You just have to know why or when you want to use those, and you have to know if you're using those. We're going to say create our multicam, and you will see as I do this, it goes very quickly. It's synchronized all of those clips. When I open it up, I see that I have all three sources. Looking at it on this zoomed out view, they all look like they line up pretty well. The screen recording looks like it's lined up pretty good. It's not. When we zoom in, you'll see that. And the ZV-1 looks like it's lined up pretty well. Toward the end, things are not lined up quite so well. One thing that you won't ever get is all three of these things to line up exactly 100% with each other, because they were all, as I said before, freewheeling. They were all recording, doing their own thing, and now we're asking them to talk together. A little bit of a mismatch is not noticeable. A few milliseconds, you won't notice a lag. It's when things get really out of whack with drift, which you will see in our further examples here. So I'm going to close this example multicam. I don't need it because I've already set up my samples here. I said I wouldn't really be explaining these terms, but we have 30 frames per second. We have 29.97 non-drop, 29.97 drop, 23.98. There are other frame rates, but I'm going to use those four. I did my first multicam and I created it as a 30 frame per second multicam. So regardless of what all that footage is in, I brought it into a clip that says you're going to be 30 frames per second. Final Cut Pro does a thing which is called conforming it, which it makes all of those videos, it in the background adjusts them so they fit with that frame rate. We didn't shoot this stuff at 30 frames per second, but let's see what happens that we brought all of those in. And did Final Cut Pro have a problem with that? And we're going to zoom in quite a bit so we can see how things are lining up. Like I said, things won't ever line up exactly perfectly. Here's the start of the EOS. The ZV-1 starts over here a little bit, and the screen recording starts here. But they're all close enough that it's not a problem. I'll show you that. So here's the EOS with its audio. We would expect it to be in sync. So I've had my Tone X capture and Tone X pedal for... So that looks good. We take the ZV-1. Now remember, I said it's not exactly lined up, but it's a very small amount out, and you aren't going to see a difference. I've had my Tone X capture and Tone X pedal for... So that's looking synced up well. You hear a difference because it's a different mic source. Same thing with the screen recording. It's 3 different mic sources, so the tone will be different. But the synchronization looks okay. I've had my Tone X capture and Tone X pedal. Even on the screen recording, it all looks good. Sound travels generally at 1,088 feet per second. It's convenient because you can break that down, a millisecond being a thousandth of a second, and sound traveling about 1,000 feet in a second. You can say a millisecond equals a foot of distance. So a millisecond of delay would be, for example, the difference between me talking at you right here or backing up a foot and talking to you. That audio is going to be a millisecond later. 2 feet, 2 milliseconds. 20 feet, 20 milliseconds. And within certain parameters, our brain just accepts that. It will look at a certain amount of audio synchronization mismatch and just say, yeah, that's fine. I don't even notice it. So that's why this all works at the beginning. At the end, though, where things have drifted quite a bit, again, on the screen recording, I'm not telling you about the ZV-1. We're going to look at that. We would expect the EOS to still be in sync with itself. It was all recording to the same device at the same time. You can also see here, looking at this, the ZV-1 looks still pretty close to the EOS, but over here, the screen recording is clearly quite a bit off. What does it sound like? Let's listen. Here's the EOS with its audio. We shouldn't really have a problem here. We wouldn't expect one. The built-in guitar player, and see how that sounds. So that looks fine. How is it for the ZV-1? It's not exact, but it still looks really close. We know how that sounds. We also can try No, I'm not having a problem with that. That looks okay. We've got the audio track from the screen recording. We know how that sounds. We also can try wow. Clearly, we're out of sync. That's drift. Over time, it has gone drastically out of synchronization. Let's listen to the EOS and the screen recording audio at the same time. We know how that sounds. We also can try kind of like we had a little too much fun on the weekend. We have a clear problem. How does the ZV-1 sound along with the EOS audio? Input. We know how that sounds. We also can try. No problem. You can hear a difference, but it's not a problem with one or the other in isolation. And why would we take two tracks that are otherwise exactly the same and play them both at the same time? In general, we wouldn't do that. So we're 30 frames per second, and the audio doesn't line up with the video. Let's look at it at 29.97 frames per second non-drop. My EOS and my ZV-1 both record at 29.97 frame per second drop. But we're 29.97 frames per second non-drop. Let's see. We'll just look at the screen recording. That's the only one we're concerned about now, the audio for the screen recording in relation to the EOS video. So at the beginning, how does it look? I've had my Tone X capture and Tone X pedal. It's synced up well. We go down to the end here. I certainly don't feel it. So here we are. Nope, we're still out of sync. But we didn't set ourselves to 29.97 frames per second drop frame. We're still non-drop. So let's set it to drop frame. Maybe that's where the problem is coming from. And we'll play it at the beginning. I've had my Tone X capture and Tone X pedal for... They're all lined up at the beginning, but what happens down at the end? Our levels, everything's plugged in right. We're getting good signal. No, we're out of sync, and we've got everything set exactly how it should be. Are we screwed? No, but we do have some work to do. For some giggles, let's look. I've taken all of this to what I would probably release this video at anyway, which is 23.98 frames per second. So I've created that multicam with those clips in there, conformed them all to that, and what do we get? Does it maybe magically fix our problem? I've had my Tone X capture and Tone X pedal. Okay, still lines up good at the beginning. At this point, we should expect that. But what about down at the end? Okay, so there we are. We've set all of our levels, everything. We're still out of whack. So nothing we do with general settings is going to resolve this drift issue. So does that mean we can't use that track? Does it mean we have to reshoot something? No, we can fix this, but we have some work to do to fix this. There are two general ways that I will fix something like this. One takes a little bit more work. The other one is easier to do, but can potentially be damaging to the quality of your audio or video. So I'll show you that right now. I guess just to say we're working with everything as we would recommend working with it, these are the clips where everything is 29.97 frames per second, except the QuickTime screen recording. I suppose I should show you this. What does this variable frame rate mean? If we look at it in Final Cut Pro, we can look at the inspector up here, and it shows us that this is a 59.94 frame per second clip. It's not. That's what Final Cut Pro sees it at. It's not a set frame rate. We can find out a little bit, get a bit of a clearer picture. We'll open it in QuickTime, and I use the inspector. Now you remember that Final Cut Pro said it was 59.97 frames per second, but here it says it's 42.56. You don't want to have to reshoot everything. So what do? The easiest is to just retime either the audio or the video. If we look at this peak right here, on the EOS, on our problem footage, that peak is all the way over here. And we don't want it all the way over there. So we take that clip, we go up to our timing tool, select custom, and then it gives you this green bar at the top with this little mark. And when you put your mouse over that, you see it's like a clock with an arrow going around like that. and you can drag it, and you can retime your clip. And you see what happened as I moved that, the whole thing came over more. I went too far. I overshot this. So let's undo that. Here's the EOS, and here is how far out of sync the screen recording is. So I'm going to drag that little handle over here by roughly this amount. And we can fine tune it as we go. That looks close. We can make a choice of it being a little early or a little late. It doesn't matter. That's pretty close. So now, without doing anything else, and we go back here and we listen. And again, it's still the screen recording audio and the EOS video. So once we got all of this, we got the live input. We know how that... There, magic. It's lined up. And for most videos where it's talking, that's not going to be a problem. Anywhere else, you aren't going to notice it. We go in the middle of the file here. Kind of detail that a little bit more as we go through. It looks in sync there. So there, we've solved our problem. The only thing with this is that if you go a great amount, let's retime this so it's roughly twice as long. And now we listen to this audio. Not only is it going to now be way out of sync, it's going to sound really weird. Both of the input stages are... So it's really slow, but you can also hear the quality of the audio has suffered quite a bit. If you're doing that on a track where it's music, a guitar playing to a guide track or something, it becomes even more noticeable, and it introduces some phasing issues. We're just going to take the retiming out. So now it's back, and we could retime the video. There's where the EOS is, and here's where the audio is. It's the same thing. We're just doing it to the video instead of the audio. Roughly that far. And now we've retimed the video to fit the audio. And let's have a look. I also, it doesn't really matter, but in case any noise or... So there, we've synced up as well. So 2 ways to do that. And if we go back into the middle of the file here somewhere. So that's the setup. We'll kind of detail that a little bit more as we go through. You can trust your ears and your eyes for which one you like better. I don't like to retime audio or video if I don't have to. So I'm going to show you another way we could do this. I would probably retime the video before I retime the audio, but as long as it sounds good, I don't mind retiming audio. As long as it looks good, I don't mind retiming video, and sometimes it's the quickest solution. But what if, for whatever reason, you can't do either of those? I'm going to go in here and I'm going to remove these retiming settings. Just make sure I have everything back to the way it originally was. This way of dealing with the sync issue is not as destructive. We accept a certain amount of that drift up until the point where it becomes really obvious, and then we cut and we realign everything. We've already seen how at the beginning it lines up pretty well. Let's see how far it goes before it's so out of sync we really start to notice it. 5 minutes. KT88, or with the KT66, so that one has a KT60. I can kind of notice it there. So let's split that difference. Let's go down to about 2.5 minutes. So good for live. And that's always been something that's looking lined up pretty well there. If we say we're going to accept it up to there, we're getting a little bit off. But I'm going to cut this here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the audio track and I'm going to realign it. Simple as that. Now it's lined up again. It's bought us another 3 minutes, maybe more. Thing that I've... Of course, it's lined up at the beginning. Let's go down to 6 minutes. These are designed specifically, or these have been modified specifically. It's still looking okay. We'll go a little bit farther. So it makes this amp very versatile. I can start detecting that out of sync audio again. So I'm going to just cut it here again. So that's as close as we can get it. So it makes this amp very versatile. Oftentimes this is the only... So that's looking good too. So you can see how using this method, it takes a lot more work, but at the end of the whole thing, it's going to be lined up well enough that most people aren't going to notice that synchronization mismatch. Especially if they're not looking for it. If you're looking for it, you will see it even if it's not there. The benefit to it is it's not messing with your audio file or your video file. It's just taking those things and moving them around. That's the beauty of a nonlinear editor. I could really do a lot more on this. I've been working with audio all my life, and digital audio for at least the last 30 years. So sample rates and bit depth and bit rate and all of that, I understand it and I can work with it. Video, I've really only been doing my YouTube channel for 2 years. I've been working with Final Cut Pro for a lot longer than that, but sort of fitting a square peg in a round hole, just making things work. I have had many issues with synchronization, and I finally got to the point where it was frustrating. I thought, I got to figure out what to do about this. The main thing is to understand not only sample rates, but frame rates, and how all of those things work together in concert to keep things synchronized, and how can you effectively and quickly deal with things being out of sync when it happens. If something's not obviously out of sync, audio or video-wise, I don't worry about it. The whole thing about frame rates has been new to me. I've known about drop frame and all of those things. We have to deal with that in audio, but not to the extent I've had to deal with it now doing YouTube. Until 2 weeks ago, I didn't understand that non-drop and drop could refer to the same frame rate. The way I always looked at it, and the only things I ever had to deal with in the audio world, was 30 frames per second or 29.97 frames per second drop, which we used to just call drop frame. So if they didn't say drop frame, we were dealing with 30 frames per second. If they said drop frame, we were talking about 29.97 frames per second drop. Like I say, until a few weeks ago, I didn't know there were two 29.97 frames per second rates, and that non-drop is actually the one that doesn't use real time. And intuitively, I would have thought that the other way around. So these things can get really confusing. So what I would say at the end of all of this, hopefully you have an understanding at least of what causes these issues and how you can do your best to avoid them when possible, but they will happen. You will have these things come up. You will have to deal with this. And I've shown you the two quickest, easiest ways, best ways to deal with it, in my opinion. There are probably many other ways. So at the end of the day, go away, do some homework on this. Don't go away. Do some homework on this. Do a little bit of learning. Sample rates, frame rates, bit depth, bit rate, and try and get an understanding of what those things mean. And even if you can't, just remember, set your audio so that it all matches as closely as possible. Bit depth doesn't matter in terms of synchronization. There's no time component to bit depth, but still, when you're just trying to make things happen, just set all your audio so it's the same. My cameras do 48 kilohertz, 16-bit. So if I were just starting out, I would set Logic to 48K 16-bit. For frame rates, I will match them. Both these cameras do match. I have another camera that I don't use a lot, my Akaso Action Cam, that only does 30 frames per second. I've never had an issue with it. I'm sure there's some kind of issue, but I've never noticed an issue with it. Final Cut Pro seems to deal with it well enough. It deals with audio pretty well too. I mean, everything, generally you can drop everything in a project and Final Cut Pro will line it up well. I think the biggest issue is these things like QuickTime that do a variable frame rate or variable bit rate, again, confusion. Look at those things. So like always, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Please check out my band One Soul Thrust. Until the next video, we'll see you.